Welcome back, friends. We'll continue with our pursuit of the English poets. I'll be talking about some of the greatest English poets down the ages. We have been doing the Romantics. I'll do Matthew Arnold and after that moving on to modernism, because we don't have much time to discuss the other greats in greater detail. But Matthew Arnold is extremely important, and I thought we'll at least briefly touch upon his works, his life, and then moving on to the modernists, Auden and T.S. Eliot. Of course, there are others, but then due to scarcity of time, we won't be able to do everyone in detail. However, we will be doing some exercises that would be inclusive of everyone from the beginning to the end and everyone in the middle. So, let us first look at the slide here and your exercises. Read the following. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find it also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Identify the poem. Your question. A. Tears, idle tears. B. Dover beach. C. Crossing the bar. D. The scholar gypsy. Next one. Read the following. Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone. Sweet though in sadness, be thou spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe, like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind, be through my lips to our unawakened earth, the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Identify the poet. A. Shelley. B. Keats. C. Wordsworth. D. Blake. Next one. Read the following. Loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show, that she, dear she, might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know, knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe. Studying inventions fine her wits to entertain, of entertaining others' leaves, to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. Who is the poet? A. Shakespeare. B. Spenser. C. Philip Sidney. D. Thomas Wyatt. Number 4. Who coined the following words? Smile, smirk, Scandinavre, wedge in bobble, obstropolous, pornosophical. Identify the writer. A. Lewis Carroll. B. James Joyce. C. Evelyn Waugh. D. Lawrence Sterne. Number 5. Which plays of Shakespeare are these titles from? Now, the question is that these are famous novels, but the titles of these novels are taken from words and phrases and expressions from some Shakespearean plays. The Shakespearean plays are given at the bottom. As You Like It, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, The Tempest, Timaeus of Athens. You have to match. So, Pale Fire, Brave New World, Under the Greenwood Tree, The Sound and the Fury, The Dogs of War. Number 6. Read the following. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire is stirring, dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Who is the poet? A. Ezra Pound, B. W. H. Auden, C. T. S. Eliot, D. Stephen Spender. Number 7. This extract, the stanza that I just showed you. So, number 7, which period does the poem belong to? A. Modernist, B. Romantic, C. Renaissance, D. Victorian. Number 8, read the following. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agreed? The day of his death was a dark, cold day. Identify the poet. A. Philip Sidney, B. Shelley, C. Tennyson, D. W. H. Auden. Next one, number 9. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can petter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill demented choirs of wailing shells and bugles calling for them from sad shares. There is a lot of alliteration and onomatopoeia. Please observe that. Your question is identify the poet. A. W. H. Auden, B. Stephen Spender, C. Thomas Chatterton, D. Wilfred Owen. Next one. Read the following. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor, hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless ermite, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new, soft fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever or else soon to death. Identify the poetic form. A. Ode, B. Ballad, C. Sonnet, D. Mock epic. Next one, number 11. Read the following. When Eternal spurned back his religion and gave him a place in the north, obscure, shadowy, void, solitary, Eternals, I hear you call gladly, dictate swift winged words and fear not to unfold your dark visions of torment. Identify the poem. A. Paradise Lost, B. The Divine Comedy, C. Paradise Regained, D. Urizen. Number 12. Which of the following essayist, not essayists, but essays, is known for Essays of Elia and Tales from Shakespeare? He is the author of Essays of Elia and Tales from Shakespeare. A. Samuel Johnson, B. William Hazlitt, C. Thomas de Quincey, D. Charles Lamb. 13. Now you have to identify a key event from the British history. In its final form, Dash of 1832 increased the electorate from around this much to this much, which was about 18% of the total adult male population in England and Wales. The vast majority of the working classes as well as women were still excluded from voting. The working classes felt betrayed by an act which made no real difference to their lives. However, the reform of Parliament had begun, and this paved the way for the popular agitation of the Chartists. These are the choices. A. The Charter Act, B. The Ballot Act, C. The Reform Act, D. The Factory Act. Number 14, read the following. And I must not omit to say that in Transylvania there is a tribe of alien people who ascribe to the outlandish ways and dress on which their neighbors lay such stress, to their fathers and mothers having risen out of some subterranean prison into which they were trepanned long time ago in a mighty band. Identify the work. A. The Scholar Gypsy. B. Michael. C. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. D. The Pied Piper of Hamelin. Number 15. Although it began with painting, dash had a significant impact on other modern arts in influencing literature, illustration and design. Art is directly connected to the group were major figures in symbolism, the arts and crafts movement and early fine art photography. Identify the movement. A. Pre-Raphaelite. B. Romantic. C. Modernist. D. Surrealist. Number 16. His true Penelope was Flaubert. He fished by obstinate isles, observed the elegance of Circe's hair rather than the mottos on sundials. Unaffected by the march of events, he passed from men's memory in L'Entrethisme. They saw age, the case presents no adjunct to the muse's diadem. Here are your choices. Identify the poet. A. T.S. Eliot. B. Ezra Pound. C. W. H. Auden. D. Cecil Day Lewis. Next one. Read the following. Over 100 years on, it still seems subversive and threatening. The sadomasochism of 50 Shades of Grey barely merits a raised eyebrow nowadays, but I'd definitely take another look at anyone I spotted reading dash on public transport. Which novel is being talked about? Let's look at the choices. Identify the work. A. The Immoralist by André Gide. B. Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann. C. The Fall by Albert Camus. D. Lady Chatterley's Lover by D. H. Lawrence. Next one. Read the following. If you compare several representative passages of the greatest poetry, you see how great is the variety of types of combination and also how completely any semi-ethical criterion of sublimity misses the mark. For it is not the greatness, the intensity of the emotions, the components, but the intensity of the artistic process, the pressure, so to speak, under which the fusion takes place that counts. The episode of Paolo and Francesca employs a definite emotion, but the intensity of the poetry is something quite different from whatever intensity in the supposed experience it may give the impression of. It is no more intense, furthermore, than Canto 26, the voyage of Ulysses, which has not the direct dependence upon an emotion. Great variety is possible in the process of transmission of emotion. The murder of Agamemnon or the agony of Othello gives an artistic effect apparently closer to a possible original than the scenes from Dante. In the Agamemnon, the artistic emotion approximates to the emotion of an actual spectator, in Othello to the emotion of the protagonist himself. But the difference between art and the event is always absolute. The combination, which is the murder of Agamemnon, is probably as complex as that which is the voyage of Ulysses. In either case, there has been a fusion of elements. The Ode of Keats contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale, but which the nightingale, partly perhaps because of its attractive name and partly because of its reputation, served to bring together. Here are your questions. Who is the author? A. I. A. Richards. B. Matthew Arnold. C. Cleant Brooks. D. T. S. Eliot and Tradition and the Individual Talent. Next. Man cannot discover new oceans unless he has the courage to lose sight of the shore. It is better to be hated for what you are than to be loved for what you are not. Believe those who are seeking truth. Doubt those who find it. Who is the author of all these quotes? A. Marcel Proust. B. Thomas de Quincey. C. André Gide. D. John Ruskin. And let's now discuss answers. So, the first one is B. Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, and the clue is in all the Greek and classical elements, the classical allusion is spread or is strewn all over the poem. Second one is Ode to the West Wind. If winter is here, can spring be far behind? Famous lines. Ode to the West Wind by P.B. Shelley. Third is C. Philip Sidney, Astrophel and Stella, and it's a sonnet. Fourth is B. Those words have been coined by James Joyce, that is B. And number 5, Pale Fire, Vladimir Nabokov's is taken from Timon of Athens. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley from The Tempest. Under the Greenwood Tree, Thomas Hardy from As You Like It. The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner from Macbeth. The Dogs of War by Frederick Forsyth, taken from Julius Caesar. April is the cruelest month, where extremely famous lines. C. T.S. Eliot. And seventh is A Modernist. It heralded the modernist movement in many respects. Eighth is W.H. Auden's Elegy in memory of W.B. Yeats. And ninth is D. Wilfred Owen's Elegy, Anthem for Doomed Youth. Number 10 is C. Sonnet, and the poem is Bright Star by John Keats. There is a movie called Bright Star based on John Keats's life. 11 is Blake's Urizen, and the author of Tales from Shakespeare and Essays of Elia, of course, Charles Lamb, one of the greatest essayists ever. Number 13 is C. The Reform Act, and 14th is D. The Pied Piper of Hamelin. You guessed it, the great folklore and the great children's story as well, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The Pied Piper who drives away the rats, but when the mayor fails to keep up the promise, he takes the children away with him and disappears in the cave forever, in a cave forever. 15th, the movement is Pre-Raphaelite A, and 16th is B. Ezra Pound. The name of the poem is Hugh Selwyn Moberly. The scandalous novel 17th A. The Immoralist by Andre Gide, and 18th is D. T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent. Number 19, again the quotes are by Andre Gide. Answer C. Andre Gide. So, now talking about Matthew Arnold, because that's the way I have structured most of the classes you have seen. We will be doing lot of exercises, and then we will be doing some analysis, some introduction to some a great movement, a great event, or a great work of art and literature, or a great novelist, or a writer, a great writer. So, Matthew Arnold, English poet and critic who lived between 1822 and 1888. He had his education at Rugby, where his father was headmaster. So, education was there in the family background. He also studied at Oxford. He taught classics for 2 years and then served for a while as private secretary to a statesman, and then was appointed inspector of schools, a position that he held for 35 years. He published 2 books in 1861, a series of lectures delivered at Oxford on translating Homer, and a report of his educational commission, The Popular Education of France. So, those were his works that he did between those years. He wrote essays in criticism in 1865, new poems in 1867, and then he wrote 2 books on Celtic literature between 1867 and 8. Of course, we have already done Culture and Anarchy and Friendship's Garland, which is a sequel to Culture and Anarchy on social criticism. He also wrote Literature and Dogma and God and the Bible. Those were his theological books. And then Irish Essays and Others, Essays in Criticism, the second series, and 2 records of an American lecture tour. He wrote Discourses in America and Civilization in the United States, all these in the late 19th century. His 2 volumes of poetry were The Strayed Reveller and Other Poems, and Empedocles on Aetna and Other Poems. These were signed only as A. His ambitious imitation of the ancients included Sohrab and Rustam, and then he also wrote Tristram and Iseult. He rejected Byronic emotionalism and continued Wordsworth's tradition of lyricism, spiritual lyricism. He wrote a series of poems called the Margaret Poems, dealing with real or imaginary romance of the poet in Switzerland, and this perhaps expresses heartfelt emotions. In Dover Beach, which we have just seen, he speaks of faith as a sea which was once at high tide, but now he can hear only its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar. The poet sees only the solace of lovers being true to one another. Elsewhere, he urges uncomplaining endurance, to think clear and quote unquote, feel deep, bear fruit well. His well-known elegy is Thyrsis, and then he also wrote The Scholar Gypsy, which is like a pastoral with echoes of Theocritus's works, okay, the Greek poets, Theocritus's work. Thyrsis was written to commemorate Arnold's friend, the poet Arthur U. Clough, and it follows all the conventions of an elegy, the pastoral conventions, scenery, lamentation, and closing on a note of hope. The other day we were talking about these features. A major concept in Arnold is the concept of disinterestedness, the effort to see the object as in itself it really is, and also sweetness and light. He also talked about reason and the will of God. As a humanist, Arnold stood for restraint, balance, and praised the ancient most highly for their intense significance, noble simplicity, calm pathos, and profoundness of moral impression. His poetry was paramount in classics, saturated with classics, and he also talked about the poetry as a genre, its power of forming, sustaining, and delighting us as nothing else can. He also used certain terms like the grand style, high seriousness, criticism of life, application of ideas to life. And in his search for these qualities, he used the lines like touchstone. Okay, a poet should be a touchstone, and all these ideas should be used as touchstone to mark the greatness of certain poets. A complex poet, but extremely delightful poet to read, and also his great ideas on criticism. So, Matthew Arnold. And while all this was going on, we have already talked about the Factory Act. We just saw the impact of the Factory Act. There was another great movement in 1832 which was called the Reform Act, and it was the result of a long struggle both in the streets and in Parliament. It had a real impact on the lives of the working classes. Until the 1830s, Britain's elections were neither representative nor balanced. A range of factors determined whether people were eligible to vote or not, including whether you lived in a county or a borough, whether your area was eligible to send an MP to Parliament at all. In a few places all men could vote, but in the vast majority of locations It depended on whether you owned property or paid certain taxes. Some boroughs, such as those in the industrial towns of Birmingham and Manchester, there were no MPs to represent them at all. At the same time, there were boroughs such as Old Sarum at Salisbury, which had 2 MPs but only 7 voters. There were also something called pocket boroughs, those owned by major landowners who chose their own MPs. Moreover, there was no secret ballot, voters were easily bribed and intimidated. A range of factors, including a popular campaign by the Birmingham Political Union, caused many people to begin to realize that change was necessary. The Prime Minister was the Duke of Wellington. He remained defiantly against reform, but soon he was forced out of office. The king during that time was King William IV, and he asked the Whig representative, they have Whigs and Tories, so Whig representative Earl Grey to form an administration, and Earl Grey used his position to pursue reform of the electoral system. So, the path of the resulting reforming bill through Parliament, it was extremely tough. However, it was finally passed on 4th June 1832 as a result of widespread public unrest, and also in the meantime Earl Grey resigned from his position, but however the bill was eventually passed. And from that great event we move on to one of the greatest modernists, T.S. Eliot, who lived between 1888 to 1965. He was born in Missouri. In 1888, he lived in St. Louis during till age 18 and then attended Harvard University. After a year in Paris, he returned to Harvard to pursue a doctorate in philosophy, but soon returned to Europe and settled in England in 1914. So, remember these things. He settled in, an American who settled in England. He began working in London first as a teacher and later for Lloyd's Bank. Remember these details. These may be trivial from the poetic or literary perspective, but may be important from the exams perspective. And then in London, he came under the influence of Ezra Pound. And then Pound recognized Eliot's passion and genius and assisted him in the publication of Eliot's works in a number of magazines, most notably the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and this was published in a journal called, in a magazine called Poetry in 1915. Prufrock and Other Observations was published as a book in 1917. Eliot was quickly established as an avant-garde poet. The Wasteland, the watershed moment came with The Wasteland in 1922, one of the single most influential poetic work of the 20th century. His other works include Ash Wednesday, 4 quartets, Sacred Woods, the use of poetry, the sacred wood, not woods, the use of poetry and the use of criticism, After Strange Gods, and Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. Eliot was also an important playwright whose verse dramas, remember verse dramas, V-E-R-C-S-E, not verse dramas include Murder in the Cathedral, The Family Reunion and The Cocktail Party. He became a British citizen in 1927. He was long associated with the publishing house Faber and Faber and published many younger poets. Eventually, he became the director of the firm and received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948. So, that is T.S. Eliot. And from Eliot, W.H. Auden, Weston Hugh Auden, who lived between 1907 to 1973. He studied a Master of Greek Literature, Old English Poetry, and Icelandic sagas. He studied at Oxford University. In 1936, he went to Spain in support of the loyalist left-wing cause. And in 1939, he left England to become a resident and then a citizen of the United States, where he taught in several universities. His early poetry was marked by a lot of emphasis on social problems, but soon he became sort of disillusioned with Marx and Freud, his earlier influences, and then he remained skeptical and satiric and ironic. He belongs to the school of T.S. Eliot, and his forms range from free verse through strict adherence to rhyme royal and adaptation of the alliterative verses of Old English poetry. His important works include poems, the orators, for the time being, the age of anxiety, and a Baroque eclogue. He also wrote Epistle to a Godson and other poems. And the idea here was and the emphasis on gentle and mannered civility. He also published a collection of criticism, The Dyer's Hand and A Certain World, a Commonplace Book, which is an annotated personal anthology with commentary, which he called a map of his mindscape. So that was English poetry for you. Because I have been talking about this period, the modernism and also T.S. Eliot, in my next class I will refer to the new critics and with a special emphasis on T.S. Eliot and his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent. So that's all for today, and before winding up, please take a look at this video, documentary on great poets of the 20th century. Thank you very much.